to have you in the episode.
Yeah, sure. Great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, of course. I think we have folks joining in from Oregon, Idaho, London. So a lot of folks joining in from different places of the world, Brian. I think I sort of wanted to have you because ZoomInfo is like a fascinating company that I've sort of observed over the years, and I think if in the whole go-to-market stack, probably next to Salesforce, ZoomInfo is like the highly valued company. If my memory serves me right, so really excited to have you guys here. I would love to sort of get a quick introduction from you for like a couple of minutes, and we can sort of dive into some questions that I want to ask you.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Law. I'm the CMO at ZoomInfo. I am coming up on the year mark at ZoomInfo. So yeah, an exciting accomplishment.
Right.
And then immediately prior to this, I was at Salesforce. I came through the Tableau acquisition, and still the majority of my career has been outside of marketing. So I started in consulting, originally people related, switched into general strategy consulting, then did strategy internally at a few companies, and then only switched into marketing about 2016.
That's
so
awesome.
still new-ish to marketing.
Right. One question before we start in, I see a lot of folks who have worked in Salesforce become CMOs, right? Is there like a particular cultural thing that you observed at Salesforce that you felt like, hey, this is a good sort of training ground for the future CMOs, or is it not? Is it just like coincidental that
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, potentially, obviously it's a really large company, but I mean, Salesforce does some really amazing things in the marketing space in terms of how to effectively think through your customer, try to position your products well. It obviously is a huge player in sort of the SaaS space, and so if you're trying to go into SaaS and you've had success growing along with Salesforce, I think it's a great training ground. So I very much appreciate the time that I had there, as well as Tableau as part of the Salesforce family.
That's awesome, right? Wait, one before we start, I think one sort of high level question about ZoomInfo, right? I think people think of ZoomInfo as a data platform, right? They get the contacts data, the lead data for them to prospect and look at their account list and go after their ICP. But it feels like ZoomInfo has just so many other products, right? Like the marketing OS, like the chatbots, the ABM platform, and different sort of things.
Yeah.
How do you guys think about sort of taking a narrative to the market? Because you might be something 10 years back, but now you're just so many different things. So it's a challenge in itself, I'm sure. Like, how are you thinking about it? What's sort of your viewpoint on how you think ZoomInfo will position itself?
Yeah, it's a very top of mind question. So actually in Q4, we did a big sort of external survey, went to sales and marketing leaders at mid-market enterprise companies and asked them how they thought about our space and how they thought about us.
Wow.
And one of the things that came through very clearly was the majority of the market still knows us for sort of being the number one B2B data company, particularly around contact data. But don't necessarily understand the breadth of our portfolio. And we've grown a ton. We're over 1.2 billion in revenue, and that's required us to sort of expand. And we're creating this integrated go-to-market platform. And so there isn't a ton of awareness in some of these other areas. So I try and break it down as simply as I can, which is we help you unlock insights. So we leverage that best-in-class data and the real-time intent to help you figure out what are the actions you should be taking. We then help you engage customers. And as you mentioned, we have a platform that spans sales and marketing. So you can do sort of ABM activities through sort of media, whether that's display or social, you can do email. We facilitate sort of chat and all of the sort of the sales engagement platforms. And then sort of the third piece, which I think is really exciting, is we talk about winning faster. And it's about how do you automate and scale all those activities.
Wow.
So that not only are you being more efficient, but you're also driving more revenue at the same time.
Interesting. And then if I were to just take a quick understanding of how the go-to-market works, Brian, it's a sales-led go-to-market. When prospects come in and sort of want a demo of the product, do they specify what product they want to get a demo of, or how does the
particularly because our key sort of persona groups that we're going after are sort of traditionally been in the sales space. Also, we have a lot of people in sort of the marketing space, and then a lot of folks from either a data or like operations point of view, whether that sits centrally or sales or in marketing. And so there's a really amazing machine that I can't take credit for. It's before my time to figure out sort of where are they coming from, which of the individuals, what would be the best type of person for them to interface with, and then sort of have that initial conversation and hopefully we guess correctly. But if not, then we route accordingly based on sort of how the conversation goes. But yeah, a lot of it is based on, again, leveraging the data that we have to then inform what would be the best sort of route to go through. And interestingly, from a new business perspective, we are very, very reliant on sort of marketing source. So it's about 3/4 of everything new business comes from sort of directly routed through marketing. And then it's sort of, call it 15 to 20-ish% are things that my team help source for our sales counterparts. We leverage obviously our own platform. And so we say, hey, here are the people that you should be outbounding to based on the research that we've done.
Interesting.
So it's a very sort of marketing dependent new business funnel, obviously a little bit less on the customer side because you already have the relationships.
Got it. Awesome. Right. I want to switch gears and talk about a book that you mentioned when you were doing some prep for this call. It's called How Brands Grow, right?
Yeah.
And you had some lot of interesting takeaways from that book that I was pretty amazed by, actually. So before we start going into the details of it, can you sort of summarize some few takeaways from that book that sort of changed your perception or informed your decision on how we should think about marketing? I would still love to hear your thoughts on that one.
Yeah. And it's the book How Brands Grow. It's written by the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which is the largest marketing research institute in the world. It's attached to the University of South Australia. And I get so much value out of the work they do. We're actually now corporate sponsors just to get even more access to their research. But they've written a few different books, How Brands Grow 1 and 2, also Distinctive Brand Assets. And so a few things that are potentially counterintuitive. So one is this idea that you should be distinctive and you should stand out versus being differentiated. So I can talk more about what that means and why that's important.
So you should be distinctive and not care too much about differentiated, right? That's like the first bold statement.
Which is bold in and of itself. Really, what they find is that brands are branded versions of the category. And so you need to be associated with a category and you need to stand out more than others. But actually trying to get into like why you're different and better than your competitors is many times lost. Because we have so many things that we're doing in our day-to-day that we actually may not be able to sort of internalize and process that information. So that's sort of the first one. The second one that's really interesting is this idea of how much you should focus on new business versus existing customer growth. And what they've found across industries, B2B, B2C, is you should focus way more on penetrating the market. So expanding your percentage of share in market and less on customer loyalty and growth, because many times what happens is customers come in and they follow a fairly standard distribution within your industry of sort of how much they're going to grow or not. And actually sort of the more reach you have, the higher retention rates you have, the higher existing customer growth rates you have. Not to say you shouldn't be focusing on customers, you totally should, but you actually get more value focusing on the net new. So I find that certainly fascinating as well. And then there's sort of maybe a little bit less contradictory, but really foundational and something that we leverage a lot is when you're thinking about trying to be successful in your marketplace, there are these two ideas. One, mental availability, and the second one is physical availability. So the mental availability is really about in a buying situation, how likely is it that someone's going to think your brand? And the physical availability is then how easy is it to sort of understand what your brand does and purchase it? And so from a mental availability point of view, really what you want to do is figure out like, what are those buying situations that are relevant? Then what are the thoughts, feelings, emotions that people have in those buying situations? Because essentially you're triggering nodes in your brain. And the way our brain works is it's a network of nodes. So, an individual memory will likely trigger another memory. So that's why sometimes when you think of something, maybe you hear a song, you might immediately associate it with that time that you did X, Y, and Z when you first heard the song. And so figuring out what those are and then attaching your brand to those thoughts or memories that you have in your brain, rather than trying to create new memories for people. And so that one is, I find, very, very applicable and valuable. And then what you want to do is have, again, that consistent distinctiveness of you want to make sure that you hammer over and over and over again on those consistent messages that tie back into how people think when they're in those buying situations. So anyway, those are a few. They have a lot more. I love that book. It's my favorite marketing book, and I think the Ehrenberg Bass Institute does some great research.
That's awesome, right? But I want to just sort of double click on all these points. Actually, the first point you mentioned is that brands should think about or focus on being distinctive and less on being differentiated in a category, right?
Yeah.
And that is so true, because if I think about, let's say, like gifting as a category, right? Whatever the players say, I know that there are 3-4 players in that category, and I will probably sort of go in the buying situation, evaluate them, and look what is different, etc., etc. But it's just very hard to convince me as to why someone is different than the other one, because that's how I think of the category in itself, right?
Yeah.
Is that the primary reason why that you think that is true, or what's the?
Yeah, and so one of the things that their research has found, and actually Bain and Google did some interesting sort of it wasn't intended to validate, but some research that validated it. And Google actually did some similar research with ComScore the year before, which was Bain and Google found that when people are going to go into buying processes in the B2B space, that almost 90% of the time they have a day one list. And if you look at the end of the process, almost 90% of the time they choose off that day one list. And so if you're not on the day one list, you could be as differentiated as you want,
Right.
but it's not actually gonna make a difference. So that piece is really, really important. And again, the more you're focusing on like how people are thinking about the problems they are solving, which is where you should be focusing, it increases your likelihood you get into that initial sort of conversation set. A related piece of research that they did was they looked at different industries and sort of the extent to which individual companies in those industries had similar customer bases. Because if differentiation really existed, you would assume company A really skews in one direction, company B really skews in another direction.
Right.
And they found across industries that actually isn't the case. Which would lend itself to this belief that it really is sort of, you get people to come in, are they known or not? I went to business school at Kellogg, which is an amazing marketing school. Would hate everything that I'm saying right now. And I remember one of the classes that we did is we did an example of you were trying to think of putting a business in market, and you wanted to see how much do you want to be sort of generic versus really, really focused in your offering. And then you had buyers who then said, oh, I really care about this, and I have perfect knowledge of the industry, the companies that are out there. Which one do I choose? And the practical reality is we don't have perfect knowledge. And we also don't have as much time in the day to be as educated as we want about sort of like what we need and what the companies can provide. And most of the time we're doing this sort of term of satisficing, like what is good enough that allows us to get what we want and allows us to move forward. So I think that's some of the baseline for the research. Can definitely go more into it, but it's we did this when I was at Tableau, and we did an assessment of how Tableau customers thought about Tableau versus Power BI customers thought about Power BI, and sort of so on and so forth down the list. And it was amazing how similar customers think about their own product, even though they're obviously different. And sort of we did something similar, here and found similar results. And so, again, a smaller sample size to validate that research, but I found it to be true.
Then on that question, Brian, how should brands think about being distinctive? Like, what are the sort of elements that you should think about when they want to be a distinctive brand?
Yeah. So, there's actually, I mentioned sort of the Ehrenberg best. I just happen to have this because I'm going to be typing in my notes. Their other book on distinctive brand assets. There's actually 5 different areas that you need to think about in terms of building out those sort of asset types. And so one of them is around faces. So like, do you want to be known attached to a celebrity? Do you want to be attached to a spokesperson? Do you want to be attached to a sort of a character? Characters best across 3, both in terms of standing out and sort of being remembered. Sound is really important. Sort of the messaging sort of components that you think about are really a key. And there's sort of a whole host of different components. But the practical reality is each part of our brain functions in sort of memory. So colors versus shapes versus words versus sounds, all can be triggered, and you want to actually line up against sort of each of those in different ways. And I think there's a lot of research that shows faces in particular are something that our brain gravitates towards. And so you want to be able to be known for those different pieces. And then there's sort of research in a process you can go through and say, at the moment, how is your brand thought of? What are the things that you have assets that are supporting that brand? And then which are the ones that you want to sort of continue to invest in? Which are the ones that are essentially supportive of the category, not of your brand? So you actually don't want to invest in those ones. And then move forward, and definitely don't want to under minimize the piece that I mentioned, which is sort of the thoughts, the feelings, emotions, and the words, the messaging framework component that is really, really key, so that you resonate when someone thinks I have this problem or this need. It then triggers your brand.
Very interesting, Brian. And then at ZoomInfo, are you sort of following these things in general, or trying to sort of get this across in your narrative?
Certainly trying to. So yeah, we'll see how it works. But I mentioned that study that we did in Q4, and we asked all those questions. We found out sort of again through freeform text what were the associations that came up most often, and that actually underlines that messaging framework that I just mentioned. Sort of the unlocking insights, engaging customers, and winning faster. is what we found is very tied into how people are thinking about the space. We're about to launch a brand campaign next month. And very much are trying to take sort of the insights from what we learned in terms of how people think about the space, what people associate with ZoomInfo, where people have less associations with us, and how we can try and change some of those mental structures that people have. So I guess to be seen, but definitely trying our best to follow the research.
Got it, right. And then the second point you mentioned, right, it's important for the customers to focus on net new business than retention, because if you look at, like, at least my LinkedIn feed, right, like everything is the opposite side, like, hey, focus on customers, retention, etc. But at least I tend to believe that, you know, once, like, you get the word of mouth, right, it just keeps growing and growing and growing, and that only comes from, like, expanding the customer base because you're trying to get more surface area, etc., etc. Is that the primary reason why you think that's the case, or what's sort of the reasoning behind why we should focus on more net new customers than retention?
Yeah, so there's some related research. So Michael Platt, he leads Wharton's neuroscience initiative, and it's sort of similar to what I said, sort of about sort of individuals' brains. They talked about it sort of across people, and this idea that when people have consistent associations with a brand, it's actually very, very powerful, and there's sort of that community effect in that sort of, if I think something, you think something, someone else thinks something, and we then sort of converse about it, it's more likely to enhance brand growth overall. And so my sense is that is definitely sort of a part of it. Again, I don't want to in any way suggest there's not value from going after customers. You can do a ton to improve your retention rates, get customers to grow, enhance sort of the way that you're reaching out to them. There's a lot of opportunity in sort of broader account-based marketing. Just what they have found over time is that there's a very, very high correlation with market penetration and your rates of retention and your success. And that sort of disproportionately focusing on bringing in new customers tends to impact them. And again, we tried to validate that at previous job in here and looked at over time, sort of just looking at yearly cohorts. When companies come in, and for simplicity, I'll say by segment, so like an SMB versus mid-market versus an enterprise, how they grow over time. If you were able to do meaningful things to sort of shift their retention and growth rates, you would expect to see, as each year you do different and new things, you would see meaningfully different changes in those sort of growth rates, retention rates. I at least haven't been able to sort of see the extent of change that I would expect relative to some of the customer growth numbers on the front side. So again, there's always sort of exceptions to the rule, but in aggregate, you can get more value by focusing on net new business.
Awesome, right? But there's one question from Kimberly that I want to sort of take. Can you talk more about the market research to understand all those things? For example, like you mentioned about how at ZoomInfo you figured out with your customers, they want the unlocking insights, winning faster, and doing a brand campaign. What research went ahead, and what partners are you using, and what outcomes define success?
Yeah, sure. So sort of a few thoughts. So I think the simplest overview, if you haven't read it, the book How Brands Grow gives you a lot of sort of those insights. And LinkedIn's B2B Institute does a really good job of summarizing those in a way that can be accessed. But sort of oversimplified, I would say figure out who is your audience that you're wanting to go after. And I'd always recommend being a little bit broader, knowing that, some people are eventually going to grow into the roles that you're interested in. Some people such as, analysts or sort of journalists, whatnot, can have sort of impact on the folks you're wanting to go after. And then figure out sort of the set of sort of questions you want to ask. So it could be as simple as, when you're thinking about this category, what are the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that come to mind? Or depending on sort of the specific space you play in, you might know exactly those buying situations. It's, when you've come to sort of a certain, finance conversation and they're telling you need to do more with X or less with X. So it's going to be a little bit dependent on sort of your specific buying situations. But then ask and say, free form, what are the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that come to mind? I would recommend prompting again and saying, thank you. Can you give us more? Extrapolate on what you just said, because many times it's the connectivity between those ideas that actually gives you a lot of insight in terms of what memories are related. I tend to then sort of follow that up with questions around what are sort of the pain points you feel when you're trying to solve those problems, and what are the emotions that you feel when you're thinking about those pain points, and then ask it about yourself and sort of your competitors. And it'll give you a sense of not only how do people think about the category, but then also where's their white space between how they think about the category and what you're doing well and what your competitors are doing well. Because if your top competitor already is very, very associated with one of those, it's going to be tougher to be successful. So I'd say that's sort of on the front end. And then from an ongoing basis, I think you can either do, and again, then you can use machine learning or less sophisticated ways to collapse all of those comments and those ideas into sort of key themes. But then in terms of rolling it out, what you want to be able to do is say, here are our key themes. You want to actually identify what are the keywords that are going to be most likely to resonate and potentially have reach, and ensure that all your content actually ladders up into and uses those keywords. And ideally, what you could do internally is have a process and say, of the content we're creating, which are the pillars that we're wanting to speak to? And then on the back end, did we do a good job of actually speaking to them? Did we incorporate the content that we want to use? And then from a more macro basis, whether you're doing sort of like a quarterly, biannual, annual survey, or using tools like Blue Ocean. Blue Ocean, I think, is a really great at-scale way to get insight into share of voice. You want to understand when people are talking about these topics, how often are they talking about your brand relative to other brands to see if you're actually having success. So I currently use Blue Ocean. We've used TalkWalker in the past, which does a lot of the same things, but not to the same extent that Blue Ocean does. And then brand surveys, you can obviously be much more targeted because you can say, here's the group that I want to reach out to. And there's, either you can go and find panels directly on your own or work through sort of agencies to do that. So hopefully, Kimberly, that answered your question at least a little bit.
That was a very thorough answer, Brian. It looks like you are deeply involved in this work instead of outsourcing to someone else. So that shows the level of depth you're showing.
I find this stuff fascinating. So for better or for worse, my team gets me weighing in on some of this stuff.
That's awesome, Brian. Brian, there are a couple of more questions I want to take.
Sure,
one from Jane. What channels are working for you to drive pipeline and ultimately revenue in 2023?
Yeah, so practically, to me, it's sort of what is the combination of channels sort of elicit? And it's a little bit different, sort of, at least for new and existing business for us. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll speak to it more broadly. So one of the plays that we run is, an opportunity has been opened in the pipeline. Let's call it a mid-market or enterprise company above a certain size. And that'll sort of trigger, and we use our sort of ZoomInfo platform to help us do this, outreach across a number of channels. So we'll do sort of display, paid social, email that comes from marketing, email that comes behalf of sales, direct mail, chat on the website. And what we'll try and do is, depending on its sort of new versus existing, the different situation, what combination of those channels actually work best to drive sort of either sort of accelerating things through the funnel, increasing the average deal size, the total results. And so I'd say figuring that out for your particular company and sort of situation is really, really important. But I would say more broadly, what we are trying to do particularly is mid-market enterprise is a focus for us, just like for many companies, they tend to grow faster, sort of renew it at greater rates. Is what's that combination of how do you create sort of broad scale awareness and get in front of people as efficiently as possible. And so again, that's through consistent messaging, but through part of what we're going to be launching is, through TV, through sort of scaled digital channels, and figuring out what's the way that you can get breadth as cheaply as possible.
Right.
Because I think sometimes we over index on spending a lot of money for being super, super targeted, which you can do and is important to do. And sort of we both do, and also sort of enable folks to get done. But the breadth is really important. So I think some of those channels, we are seeing sort of increased success, as I think many others are. And when you can get people in sort of more of a live environment, so whether that's an in-person session, we're doing a lot now in sort of small, group sessions for CMOs, CROs, which is our target market, going around in different cities. If you can get people in those scenarios, that tends to convert really well. Obviously, it's an indication of interest. So what can you do to develop the relationship to get people to do those? So how do you start providing the air cover from a digital perspective? How do you start providing content that's relevant to them so that when you then reach out and say, hey, I want to have a conversation, they're willing to do it? And so I think it's the combination of very, very scaled, sort of scaled digital efforts. How are you reaching people from a content point of view? And can use content syndication to do that targeted. Obviously, email is a helpful follow-up, but it kind of is all of them. Gartner recently put out some research that was looking at companies that are more successful in the ABM space versus ones that are less successful, and looking at where there's some gaps.
Right.
And so, interestingly, Twitter and Facebook were areas where there was bigger gaps between success. The way I internalized that was, a lot of the ABM platforms that are out there don't allow you to effectively match work email and personal email. So one of the things, again, ZoomInfo is really great at it. It has a company to personal graph. And so you can do a better job of that. And so I think those are areas that, particularly given some of the issues Twitter's had as of late, you can get maybe better reach than you might have in the
Right.
past. So a longer answer there, but yeah, a combination of channels, and it's how they all come together.
Coming in. Brian, I think we were discussing before. You mentioned, you know, a lot of plays you guys are experimenting with to improve the sales and marketing alignment and efficiency as well, especially right now. Any
Yeah.
experiments you can share with right now just to see what we can all learn from and what
Yeah. So, yeah, a few things. So, by the way, if folks aren't aware, so something that we did at ZoomInfo is we took all of our best plays, like literally the ones that we use, and then we have over 30,000 customers, and we spent a lot of time talking to them about the plays they use, and we put them all into a single website, so anyone can go and access it. And so I would recommend taking a look. So it's zoominfo.com/plays.
Okay.
And you can go there, and it's sort of the top plays, whether that's sort of new business, sort of existing business retention, says who you should think about from a target audience perspective, how you should think about the different channels. So a little bit back to the question that Jane asked, and then sort of like some samples for sort of email and things like that.
Nice.
So that's something you can take a look at. If you're a customer, you can click try it, and it'll actually take you directly into the platform. But in terms of a few things to think about, I think intent is very top of mind for everyone. And part of the reason is some of that research I mentioned, that you need to be on that day one list. So you need to understand who is considering your product so that you can effectively go after them. And so a lot of the plays around leveraging real-time intent, whether that's you realize that they've come to sort of your website, potentially your pricing page as an example is a good one. So other types of intent that we really find success in, we call it known intent. So like we reach out as a company to sort of tens of millions of people every single year and say, hey, what are the projects you're working on? And we actually get them to tell us, because we spend millions of dollars paying them to tell us. And that tends to be really, really valuable. And how can you trigger off activities based on that? Or you have a key champion that is using your product. They're a huge advocate internally, and they move. How do you take advantage of that right away? Right. They move to the new company and say, how can I help? So those are some of the things, but intent tends to be a really, really valuable way of thinking about things.
Awesome. Brian, there are a few more questions I'll take. Let me think. This is a slightly broad question, but somebody wants a list of download of all the resources and things that you sort of pay attention to, or anything that you can sort of refer.
Sure. So how to answer that question efficiently. So anything coming out of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, really, really great. Mentioned how brands grow to and distinctive brand assets. I find some of the research coming out of, I mentioned the Wharton's Neuroscience Initiative to be quite valuable. The leader wrote a book called The Leader's Brain, which talks in part about leadership, but also like how to effectively do marketing. I do think the LinkedIn's B2B Institute does a great job of their own research, but also summarizing research that's out there. So I think they're worth tracking and following. Yeah, and then there's so many. I love Don't Make Me Think, and how sort of website usability. I think it's really applicable across the board. Yeah. So, anyways, those are just a few.
Awesome, right? And then there is one question that came up. What are your thoughts on influencer marketing for B2B brands in 2023? So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be potentially more interesting given how content is going to start to be more easily created with generative AI. Right. But I think we're awash in perspective. And I think it becomes a question of how do you sort through all that noise to really determine what's valuable.
Right.
And at the end of the day, you need to say, I can't learn all of this for sort of on my own. I need to turn to some other people to get perspective. And so I think it is important. I think it's going to be increasingly important going forward. And it's really figuring out for your target audience, who carries water, who carries credibility. And that may not always be sort of the most obvious choice in terms of who to go after. So it is important. It's something that we take advantage of. Honestly, I think we could be doing more of it, and we're trying to do more of it. And we think about it in different ways. So there's sort of individuals that we work with. I think we've gotten a lot of value from this partnership that we do with Bain Consulting, because they do a ton of research in the space. They leverage our own data to underlie their platform and do a ton of consulting around go-to-market efficiency. And so I think maybe a broader definition of the word influencer, but how can you figure out where there's credibility sources in the market, and then how do you tap into them so that they can speak on your behalf?
That's awesome, right? I see Jordan here from your team, Brian. One thing I've been thinking a lot about, Brian, is that um, to your point, when content gets democratized so much, right? Events will play a lot more important role because of the actual human touch and the human conversations you'll have. Is your team thinking about how to leverage event content, right, in different sort of formats to actually bring the human element to the brand? Any thoughts on that, friend?
Yeah, and there were it's interesting because there was a another podcast that I did, and I was really impressed with the follow up that they did to take that and to put it into a lot of snackable content pieces
Right.
as well as promotional materials. Sort of Chris Mechanic is the one behind that group, and Mechanics was the podcast, and I reached out to him. I said, I'm fascinated. You all have done a really great job, and we're actually going to leverage them to try and do that internally because we do a lot of events. So we were just at Forrester last week, did a number of sessions, did our own session on sort of go-to-market efficiency with Bain, and I think we can be doing more sort of taking those and getting broader reach because the in-person events are so powerful. You can just
Right.
get into a level of detail. But I think there's that complement of how do you make the most of each individual piece that you're creating because in-person events are more expensive.
Exactly. That's true. Awesome. Let me take a couple of more questions. One comment that Kimberly made is, "I love that book. Don't make me think is still relevant to UI UX after all these years." That's a
It
uh,
it yeah, it's so true. And I always try to push my team to think about it more broadly in terms of how do you just start with how people process information and make it as easy as they can to sort of get to that other end of the funnel.
awesome. And one more question on this: how do you empower the sales team to take advantage of the intent data that marketing provides?
Yeah, so I'll answer in a sort of a specific ZoomInfo way, and then sort of a broader one. So, I mean, as a platform, what we try and do is actually enable sales and marketing to come together. So you have access to the exact same data. You can share it back and forth. One of the things that we'll do is we'll be running campaigns that sales knows about, and they actually can say, "Hey, here are additional campaigns that I want to run that we'll be able to execute against." And so it's practically for us very easy because it's within the platform itself. But it's sort of a broader comment that I'll talk to sales and marketing alignment. Through all the conversations that I'm having with sort of CMOs, CROs, and leaders, and it's probably about 20-25% of my time I spend with customers, that alignment is a huge pain point. And I think sometimes we jump too quickly to some of the technical solves. I think practically what you need to do is say, first, what are the sort of the key goals that we are going after? Then secondarily, how do we measure against those goals? Then third, how do we create sort of a consistent view of the world from a data perspective so that we are going after the same accounts rather than, sales has their own list, marketing has their own list, and each side quibbles about why the other team isn't doing the job that they're supposed to. And as part of that data, like intent should be really, really key. So how are you ingesting intent together, whether it's from a single source or multiple sources, into a consistent place so that you have that same perspective? And then ideally what you're doing is actually driving activities or plays that span sales and marketing against them. And the more that you can figure out what things work best. So, from a sales point of view, what are your best sellers doing? How can marketing help scale those across the board? And then both looking at performance on the backside. I think it's sort of that collection of process steps that are really important before you figure out sort of how you layer on technology. But those are the things that I think are important more broadly and intent specific.
Appreciate the answer, right? And then one last question from, I think, Jane. What's your number one tip for B2B marketers struggling with demand right now?
Yeah,
Because
and it's obviously tough depending on which vertical you're going after. Tech in particular is seeing sort of the biggest cuts to their budget. I was reading something yesterday that other industries aren't. They're actually growing budget. I think it really boils down to understanding like what are the pain points, what are the buying situations for your buyers, and are you speaking to those effectively so that when even if it's a smaller subset of people who are making those decisions, are you the one who's going to be thought of most frequently? And again, there's just a lot of research that shows that's the best way to do it. So I'd say that's the number one thing that I would recommend is, are you focusing on the right things and are you consistently and simply conveying those messages so that it can break through the noise?
yeah, that's well said, Brian. But also, it's tough because I feel like there are many products that got bought a lot during the pandemic, and they just don't have a need right now because it's not in a big enough pain point. I think a lot of times marketing teams get blamed because of not driving enough demand, and fundamentally there is no demand right now for the product, which is the fundamental problem. And I see this sort of going in circles and stuff. So it's an interesting the dilemma in general, I think we are seeing. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. And I think one of the things that's not necessarily a pure demand issue, but found this in research, found this internally, that when customers are coming on board, like the extent to which, and it varies company by company, but let's say the first 60 days, actually sort of start using your product is probably one of the biggest indicators of whether or not they're actually going to continue and renew. And so to the extent your marketing teams aren't playing a role there and there's a gap, I think there is a lot of opportunity. Not contrary to what I said, but sort of in complement to that if you're going to be focusing on sort of existing customers, it's getting that initial adoption and outreach that is really important.
I mean, one last question from my end, actually. Obviously, now you've sort of been a CMO of a public company. Like, what skill sets or abilities do you think a future CMO should have, right? From what you observed in your own colleagues, from what you've learned from ZoomInfo, what are some of the things that you think a CMO should have in their arsenal if they have to be a successful one?
Yeah, and we chatted a little bit about this before. So when I personally was going through sort of the CMO interview process, when I was talking to other CMOs about how they thought about it, and advising others that are now trying to go through the process, it seems like many times sort of we're evaluated in three buckets. Like, are you a demand gen CMO? Are you a brand CMO? Are you a product marketing CMO? Right. Obviously, there's a lot more to marketing than that.
Right.
But that seems to be sort of the mental model that everyone places this in. And they all have their sort of their value. And what I would say, it's probably tough, particularly if it's your first time being a CMO, to do all three of those well. But I think you want to at least be sort of knowledgeable enough to be able to articulate how those work, and then sort of how you can leverage others to get things done. The Wall Street Journal recently did an article on it, and it was saying, increasingly of those three, demand gen is just taking on more prominence. And probably not surprisingly, you have a lot of focus on financial results at the moment, and you have both Forrester and Gartner did versions of this in Q4, and they found that sort of in the realm of about 20%, they expect demand gen to actually move into sales. Not that they're advocating for it, but just because there's so much focus on it, and at least a little bit of frustration that maybe marketing isn't focusing enough for delivering results on the demand gen side. And so I would say, if you're not focused on demand gen, I would make sure you're doing everything you can to brush up on sort of that side. And that's inclusive of understanding the channels, having a strong sort of analytics bent, and really sort of honing in on what are the key metrics that sales cares about, how do things translate through the funnel. And then increasingly sort of technology is playing a role. And so I think sort of like that marketing ops and analytics component to broader demand gen is really key and will continue to be key, particularly as things like generative AI facilitate more scaled outreach that, again, requires sort of data and technology to be successful.
Awesome. Appreciate that, Brian. Brian, just one question from the audience, folks. It's a good question. You've had a good career so far. What's left on your professional bucket list? Anything that's left that you feel you're looking forward to? Or
yeah, so I'm currently I'm practically really happy in my role. And when I was younger, something I always wanted to do was become a CEO. I think now that I have sort of two daughters that are sort of coming on 5 and 3, that becomes a trade-off of how much do I care about those things versus I want to spend time with my family. And I think increasingly being able to figure out that balance and set aside some time for my wife and kids is important. So yeah, I would say at the moment, the big thing I want to do is be able to take all of that research that I went through and talked about and really try and validate it and prove it out. I'd say that's sort of like a near-term goal. But I continue to be fascinated about how our brains work and how you can apply it to marketing and maybe doing more on the academic side at some point.
No, that's awesome, right? I've done so many interviews, but you brought so much research to this topic that I feel like there's just so much science to what we do, and I'm sort of just scratching the surface of what is possible. So I'm sort of excited to have you here. But thanks again for the time today. I really appreciate you taking some time out and sort of sharing what you've learned and what you look forward to. So appreciate the time and effort today, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you. Bye.